If we were making a movie about Southern Pacific's crossing of the Cascade Mountains in western Oregon, it would be a sleeper, a low-budget film that will undoubtedly achieve success after a period of obscurity. The 44 miles that constitute this portion of SP's Cascade subdivision form one of the undiscovered treasures of western railroading. The reason for the line's obscurity is the same as the key to its popularity, the Cascade Mountains. The Cascades were formed some 40 million years ago by eruptions from a chain of volcanoes scattered through today's Willamette Valley. Triggered by the movement of enormous crustal plates, intense volcanic activity produced thick accumulations of lava and ash that built up the western Cascade volcanoes. 35 million years of folding and tilting left the Cascades with a sloping ramp on the west side and a steep face on the east, the cause of the rain shadow that dramatically changes the climate between western and eastern Oregon. SP's Cascade Crossing is part of SP's so-called I-5 corridor. Like the nearby interstate highway it's named for, the route links Portland to the north with Los Angeles and other California destinations to the south. We're going on location to Oregon, specifically to the foot of the Cascades at Oak Ridge. From there, SP's Cascade sub heads roughly southeast to McCready Springs. At Heather, the line crosses Salt Creek and rounds a horseshoe curve that points westbound trains back in the direction of Oak Ridge. The tracks continue northwest through Wikipe to another horseshoe curve, and from there the main line curves back southeast to Fields. Less than 4 miles away lies Fraser, located on the upper level of the Cascade Loops. The tracks continue to Cruzette, then head southeast to Abernethy before reaching the top of the grade at Cascade Summit. But a map alone can't explain the spell that the crossing weaves on those who've discovered its secret.
I think the SP and the Cascades is by far and away one of the neatest places I've ever been to. It's very spiritual in a way, because you know the SP is just hanging there up the side of these mountains, and it almost seems like it's the only place I've ever been to where man really hasn't really beaten nature yet. You know, like Mother Nature could just hiccup and the SP would fall off the side of the mountain.
For westbound trains, the show begins at the foot of the Cascades in tiny Oak Ridge. A columnist for the Oak Ridge Telegram newspaper once dubbed Oak Ridge the Shangri-La of the Cascades. If that's the case, then paradise on earth once boasted round-the-clock train order service. The first train order office was established in 1922 at the Oak Ridge Passenger Station, which used to be located behind us near the west end of the yard. It was closed in 1955 in favor of centralized traffic control, which allows a dispatcher to control switches and signals from a machine in a remote office. The second train order office was established at the east end of the yard in 1943 to handle the glut of traffic triggered by World War II. Located around the curve in the distance, it was named Tunnel because of its proximity to Tunnel 22 on the west side of town. 4 years after the war ended in 1945, Tunnel was closed. Even without a train order office, Oak Ridge remains a critical command post in SP's war against the Cascades. The three-stall engine house and water column that once catered to SP's steam engines are long gone, superseded by diesels that required less care. Like the steam engines that once gathered at Oak Ridge, the diesels backing down on this westbound are helpers. Their job is to lend extra tractive effort to trains headed up the mountain. During Steam's reign, 30 extra board employees covered the 4 helper jobs based here. Now the helpers simply travel the 70 miles back to Eugene at the end of their workday. What you'll find at Oak Ridge instead of steam engines and train order stands is maintenance of way equipment, such as these hopper cars loaded with rock ballast. The buildings scattered around the west end of the yard belong to SP's track department. A roadmaster at Oak Ridge is responsible for track materials such as these stacks of wood ties. He oversees the people who repair and maintain the track, otherwise known as the track gang or the section. One of the important characteristics of track is that all of its components, rail, ties, spikes, and ballast, wear out, and they can be replaced without seriously impeding the flow of traffic. Machines such as these can lift the track, scrape up and clean the ballast, and return, realign, and tamp the track to its new bed. Another weapon in the track department's arsenal is the work extra. These are maintenance of way trains that load or unload ties and other track components in the summer or plow snow in the winter. Work extras often draw the oldest locomotives, and this train is no exception. SP 4411 is an EMD SD9, a 1750 horsepower 6-motor diesel with more than 30 years of service to its credit. But the 4411 is more than just a locomotive in twilight. It harkens back to a time when the SD9 was synonymous with SP's Western Oregon branch lines. The affluent Portland suburb of Lake Oswego saw SD9s on the Whiteson Turn, the local that worked SP's Newburgh branch before it was leased to a new operator, the Willamette and Pacific. As a branch line engine, the SD9 is a bit of a contradiction. Compared to a 4-motor diesel, the long wheelbase 6-motor truck can be a problem on sharp curves. On the other hand, the SD9 has 50% more traction motor thermal capacity, which means it can lug that much more tonnage up a grade where low-speed horsepower is needed. The SD9's contradictions didn't stop many of the operators who took over many of SP's Oregon branches in the early 1990s. When the port of Tillamook Bay grew to a 95-mile-long short line, it chose the same SP SD9s that had served the line previously. SP's SD9s came to be known as Cadillacs, perhaps because of their length or the smooth ride afforded by their Flexicoil trucks. Their showcase may have been the Renard Turn, when 5 of them were coupled together for the Sunday-only local between Portland and Hillsboro. On paper, the SD9 was little more than a stretch limo version of its 4-motor cousin, the GP9. This Willamette and Pacific GP9 has the same mechanical and electrical gear as the SD9. And even though the SD9 is longer, both models are equally as tall. So why does the 4411 and its kin have that humongous ladder instead of the Jeep's grab irons? Or that bulge around the radiator section at the end of the long hood? And what's the story behind all those louvers sliced into that massive underframe? Whatever the reasons, they only enhance the mystique of the Cadillacs. Another piece of hardware linked with SP in Western Oregon are wigwag grade crossing signals. There's an 8,500-foot siding located at McCready Springs, 11 miles west of Oak Ridge. A westbound freight holds the siding as Amtrak's eastbound Coast Starlight skims past on its journey between Los Angeles and Seattle. After Amtrak clears, the freight makes its move. Long before trains were meeting here, McCready Springs was the site of a hot spring. In 1916, Judge William McCready bought an interest in the fledgling resort that had grown up around the spring and built the hotel in McCready Springs. SP passenger trains once delivered passengers to and from here, but fire destroyed the main lodge in 1958, and a flood in 1964 wiped out the rest of the resort. How you see Southern Pacific depends on your point of view. For railgang RG-20, SP consists of little more than the track they're spiking as they inch along the main west of McCready Springs. In reality, though, Southern Pacific Rail Corporation serves 15 western and southwestern states over roughly 14,500 miles of track. From this hot, dusty stretch of track in the Cascades, SP reaches across the Rockies in the southwest to meet river barges, trucks, and major eastern railroads at Chicago, St. Louis, Memphis, and New Orleans, not to mention major gateways into Mexico. At Heather, we find Work Extra C1 struggling upgrade with a loaded ballast train. It doesn't help that the 4411 is having problems, leaving tunnel motor 8380 to do most of the work. The second train represents SP's premium West Coast train service, the Pacific Coast Express, but with a twist. It's actually two trains in one. The boxcars and the intermodal traffic beyond the lead units represent train PTLAF, which stands for Portland to LA Fast Freight. On the other hand, these Dole and May trailers represent PTPCX, which translate to Portland to Pacific Coast Expediter. Normally, helper engines are coupled to the head end of westbound intermodal trains, but these helpers have been placed mid-train because of the combined train's exceptional length and weight. Highway 58 ducks under the SP at Salt Creek Bridge, just around the corner from Heather. The highway more or less follows the SP between here and Oak Ridge. At this point, the Cascade line makes an arc that rivals Conrail's Horseshoe Curve in Pennsylvania. When the train crosses the bridge, it's headed geographically back to Oak Ridge. On the other hand, this eastbound is headed to Oak Ridge. The dark green Morrison Knutson GP40 and the second-hand Union Pacific SD40-2 were leased on a short-term basis in 1994 to solve a motive power crunch. Your mind tells you these diesels reflect the purchase of SP by the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad, but your heart insists that this is what the old Milwaukee Road must have looked like as it struggled across the Cascades in western Washington, several hundred miles and a lifetime away from here. Wikipe was once a regular water stop for westbound trains headed up the mountain. Eastbounds, on the other hand, simply rolled down the hill. Diesels may have eliminated the stop for water, but they remain at the mercy of the Cascade Line's steady 1.8% ruling grade for the westbounds, the longest continuous grade on the SP system. SP freights on the Cascade Line are mostly in the hands of diesels built by the Electromotive Division of General Motors, or EMD. This eastbound train rolling out of Tunnel 18 at milepost 557.8, that's because SP measures all distances from the railroad's headquarters in San Francisco, which is milepost 0. The area between Tunnel 17 and Fields is known as slide, as in landslide. In recent years, an extensive drainage network has been built to remove the underground water that causes the ground to be unstable. Nonetheless, SP wages a continuous battle to keep the main from sliding down the hillside, and a 20-mile-per-hour permanent slow order remains in effect here. If these diesels had beautiful scenery indicators, they would undoubtedly be lit as this westbound rolls through the slide. At milepost 26.2, Fields is roughly halfway between Oak Ridge and the top of the pass. The siding here is 8,590 feet long, plenty of room for the SP dispatcher in Denver to arrange a meet between an eastbound freight and Amtrak number 11, the westbound Coast Starlight. Fields was named for Joseph and Reuben Fields, who were members of the Lewis and Clark expedition of 1803. There's plenty of evidence at Fields that the Cascade Line's a modern railroad. For example, the second unit in this power consist is a Rio Grande SD50, a 3,500 horsepower unit built by EMD in 1984. And the EMD F40s and Superliner passenger cars on the 1993 version of the Coast Starlight are hardly relics of the Industrial Revolution. But at times SP can look like it hasn't changed much since the days when Richard Nixon was president and all four Beatles could still come together to make music. We're standing on what used to be a 5,450-foot-long siding at Fraser. It was torn up in 1994 to cut costs. By removing the siding, SP saved the cost of maintaining the track, signals, and switches. The salvaged components were then reused elsewhere on the railroad. Former president of the SP, Ed Moyers, had accomplished much the same thing with the Illinois Central in the 1980s when it was known as downsizing. But the benefits of downsizing may be lost on SP train crews and dispatchers who have to make do with one less place to meet trains on the mountain. The 5 miles of the Cascade Line west of Fraser don't have a name. Technically, this is part of Pengra Pass, which was named in honor of B.J. Pengra, who, along with W.H. Odell, discovered the pass in 1865. Railroaders simply refer to it as the Hill. One of the things that makes this section of the Cascade Line special are the concrete snow sheds that SP built to keep snow from falling on the right-of-way in unstable slide areas.
I think my favorite spot up on the SP and the Cascades were the snow sheds, and in particular a snow shed called number 12. The reason I liked it so much was because it looked like something that the Romans had built before the birth of Christ, and that they'd left behind when they'd retreated from the area. What was special about that rock shed was just the way the mountain had leaned on top of that shed. It's like the mountain had slid down on top of it. So here was this rock shed trying to keep the mountain off the tracks, and instead the mountain looked like it was sort of just leaning up against it, ready to collapse the whole thing down the railroad.
Tunnel 7 is one of 9 tunnels between Fraser and Cruzette, the next timetable station up the mountain. At 3,164 feet, Tunnel 7 is one of the longest tunnels on the Cascade Line. But facts and figures can't begin to describe how we felt the first time we witnessed the passage of a westbound train here. According to the Association of American Railroads, Class 1 railroads operate 126,000 miles of mainline track. But they don't say how many of those miles of track are graced with waterfalls like the one at the east end of Tunnel 6 on the Cascade Line. One company that's happy to promote tunnels and waterfalls is Amtrak. The power on the eastbound Coast Starlight is a pair of GE P-32s. Even when you can't see much of anything, there's something worth seeing between Fraser and Cruzette. SP couldn't seem to make up its mind about the train order office at Cruzette. It was open between 1927 and 1930, and then again from 1936 to 1955. Although the operator controlled the power switch at the east end of the siding, the turnout in the foreground was a spring switch dubbed the rubber switch. Trains leaving the siding could run through the switch without slowing down to pick up the rear-end crew member, who would otherwise have to line the turnout behind the train. Cruzette was once a mandatory water stop for trains powered by SP's 4000 series Malley steam locomotives. Now, diesels like this Amtrak F40 skim through Cruzette without pause. Further proof that Cruzette is left to pass behind can be found at nearby Tunnel 7. This westbound freight reminds us that curves have an impact on overall train performance. That's because extra friction occurs when trains roll through a curve, which leads to more wear on wheels and rails. Only one of the three SD9s on this eastbound near Abernathy is operable. One is being ferried to Oak Ridge to replace the ailing 4411 on the work extra. The other has burned up its dynamic brakes going down the grade. At Tunnel 3, the Cascade sub passes through the last ridge separating the west and east slopes of the Cascades. We're 4,839 feet above sea level at the top of Pengra Pass, the summit of SP's crossing of the Cascades. Tunnel 3 marks the east end of Cascade Summit. By this point, the grade is leveled off, the exclamation point at the end of the longest continuous grade on the SP system. Cascade Summit has long served as a place to remove helper engines. Before the advent of bidirectional diesels, steam engines were turned on a Y with a unique feature, a tail track located inside a single-ended tunnel. Most eastbound simply roll through Cascade Summit, but this particular train doesn't have enough dynamic braking to safely head down the mountain, so it has to wait for helpers with dynamic braking. The helpers in question happen to be pushing this westbound to Crescent Lake, 8 miles west of here. There, the helpers will cut off and return to Cascade Summit to help the eastbound down the mountain. In the meantime, the eastbound's conductor gives the westbound and the helpers a visual inspection called a roll-by. When the helpers return from Crescent Lake, they move east, stop, then move back west on top of the waiting train. Dynamic brakes temporarily use a diesel's traction motors as generators. The resulting electromagnetic force retards the train's momentum. The end result is a sizable savings in wear and tear on brake shoes and rigging throughout the train, and a safer trip down the mountain to Oak Ridge. At first glance, Oak Ridge doesn't look much different in the winter than it did 2 summers ago. In western Oregon, overcast skies are the norm, regardless of the season. Even SP's locomotives look unchanged, as gray and dingy as always. No, the difference between summer and winter in the Cascades isn't readily apparent until you notice the work equipment parked in Oak Ridge Yard. For example, this tractor is clearly designed to deal with snow right down to its tracks and front-end snowplow. At the other end of the spectrum is this Jordan spreader. The hydraulically controlled snow wings can remove snow from outer rail areas up to 16 feet from the center of the track. The Jordan spreader shares its daylight paint scheme with another piece of track equipment, the Snowflake. But unlike the spreader, SPMW 5923 is the real thing, a passenger car that's been converted to a crew car for the track department. Once, the Snowflake was a member of SP's crack inner-city passenger train fleet. Now it follows the Jordan spreader and snow fighting service in the Cascades. What hasn't changed at Oak Ridge is the sight of eastbounds rolling through town without stopping. The bridge we stood on 2 years before still straddles the middle of Oak Ridge Yard, but westbounds such as this one look different when seen from the ground near the location of the Oak Ridge Depot. The wigwag has vanished from Dunning Road grade crossing, which lies just beyond the curve in the background, but the Cascade sub still hums with trains headed down the 1% grade into Oak Ridge. When the first settlers came to the upper Willamette region in the 1860s, Native Americans warned them of an evil place near this spot called Baby Rock. According to legend, Indians had perished from the bites of a mysterious animal that dwelled inside the rock. The animal, it was told, left tracks that resembled a baby's footprints. The settlers maintained that the animal was a porcupine, but the locals weren't having any of that. They knew about Baby Rock, and they steadfastly refused to go near it. Two years haven't produced an investor interested in rebuilding the hot spring resort here at McCready Springs, but the siding is still being put to good use. During our first visit here, there was water standing in the ditch next to the tracks. Now there's water falling from the sky in the form of snow. Between 1993 and 1995, SP purchased more than 490 new or rebuilt locomotives, including this pair of EMD-built SD70Ms leading in eastbound freight through Heather. Last year, SP hauled 728 million carloads of intermodal traffic, 19.8% more than it handled when we last visited Heather in 1993. Intermodal accounted for $851 million in gross freight revenues, a 16.5% jump over 1993. Another thing that hasn't changed is the percentage of forest products that SP handles. A large chunk of this traffic consists of paper products that move in a traditional boxcar. Last year, SP handled 226,000 carloads of forest products, which accounted for $432 million in gross freight revenues. One of the biggest changes to the Cascade sub is the use of fewer diesels to haul westbounds up the mountain. For others, SP's I-5 corridor is about trains and scenery, and for them, the view of the tracks at Salt Creek Bridge is nothing less than transcendental. This westbound at the slide has a surprise in its consist, a Soo Line SD60. Soo Line pays back horsepower hours owed to SP by allowing it to use Soo diesels offline. By the same token, SP units can be found hauling trains on Soo Line. What we didn't see on the Cascade line in 1996 were the leased units we found on many SP trains a few years earlier. With the addition of 203 new GE-8s and 9s in 1995, SP seems to have a grip on its locomotive supply problems. Fields has long been an important point on the Cascade line because of its proximity to the winter snow line. But from the look of things at the west end of the siding, that line has been overrun with a vengeance. Going downgrade is often as much of a challenge as going up. To prevent it from running away, this heavy eastbound grain train is restricted to 12 miles per hour as it heads through Fraser. the extra dynamic braking provided by these helper locomotives gives the train more power to slow down or stop. How fast do weather conditions change in the mountains in winter? Well, consider this scene near Tunnel 6 at Cruzette on the morning of our first day on the pass. Yeah, there's a bit of snow on the plow of the lead SD70M on this eastbound freight, and water's dripping from the sides of the cars. The conditions are essentially dry. Eight hours later, this is what we found at the same location. What used to be the rubber switch at the west end of the Cruzette siding is now a hot switch, thanks to a hot air switch heater that provides up to 900,000 BTUs of hot air to melt ice and snow. The sound you hear is a fan powered by a propane motor. Unfortunately, Highway 58 isn't equipped with anything like a switch heater. During our winter visit, the road alternated between wet and slippery and icy and slippery. Cautious driving was the order of the day. On the other hand, driving Highway 58 was better than driving the unpaved Forest Service roads that crisscross the nearby Willamette National Forest. We discovered that unpaved logging roads are not where you want to drive if you don't want to shake up your kidneys. In particular, you want to watch out for the other guy, especially when the other guy happens to be a road grader that can push you off the side of the mountain like a Mattel Hot Wheel. After several days of heavy snow, SP hired a giant bulldozer to clear the road to Cruzette. But as we soon learned, snowy and access roads weren't the half of SP's winter weather problems. The Cascade Mountains see 60 to 100 inches of rainfall annually. About a foot of it is already on the ground here at Tunnel 3. Cascade Summit was once home to an SP restaurant operated for the benefit of train crews, otherwise known as a company beanery. It's long gone, along with the train order station that used to be here. This turned out to be our last visit trackside to Cascade Summit. Within a few days, a winter storm had dumped close to 5 feet of snow here, more than our four-wheel drive Nissan could handle. Even a case bulldozer hired to plow the road to the camping grounds near the summit was rendered impotent by the storm. Even after they crest Cascade Summit, SP's westbound crews have to travel another 100 miles before they can tie up at Klamath Falls. But there was a time when their crew terminal was only 8 miles west of the summit at a place called Crescent Lake. Crescent Lake was once the division point between the Portland Division to the north and the Shasta Division to the south. In the station, 2 operators churned out train orders around the clock. Assigned pool cabooses were switched between trains crossing from one division to another. Crew quarters for 100 people were provided in the company hotel, a 2-story structure nicknamed the Hilton or the Clubhouse by train crews. The first shadow to fall on Crescent Lake was the merging of the Portland and Shasta divisions into the Oregon Division in 1964. A subsequent agreement eliminated pool cabooses, which killed off the Crescent Lake switcher. The final blow came in 1972 when train crews began running through between Eugene and Klamath Falls. Today, Crescent Lake is little more than a reason to blow the horn at the grade crossing at the east end of the old yard. But sometimes even that can be exciting.
We'd set up at the grade crossing at Crescent Lake to take some pictures of Amtrak. We knew by the green signal and by the scanner that Amtrak was coming. The road was being used lightly there at the grade crossing, people going snowmobiling, when all of a sudden this 77 Chevy lumbers up, pulling a trailer that's way too heavy for it, and gets stuck smack in the middle of the grade crossing right on the main line. Now, we knew Amtrak was going to be coming at any moment, so we dropped everything and we quick ran over and tried to get him off the rail. We
tried pushing. We had shovels out, digging, trying to dig this gentleman out, and it was a very difficult job. We were able to get him off the rail, and not 30 to 45 seconds went by, and Amtrak came running by at 70 miles an hour, and we felt pretty good because we prevented what could have been a very serious accident.
How deep was the snow at Crescent Lake during our visit? Consider this SP maintenance of way grader. It was sent to clear a path along the tracks for SP vehicles, but it came close to being declared missing in action. We wonder if we're going to have to shove the grader out the same way we shoved the van out of the way of Amtrak. But the operator finally gets one massive tire up on the right-of-way ballast, and he's out of here. The locomotive will ride down the mountain started out as the AMD 103 before being christened the Genesis Series 1. We'll stick with the unit's nickname, the P40. Like its freight cousin, the P40 is equipped with a 16-cylinder, 4,000 horsepower engine. But unlike the conventional cast steel trucks used on the freight diesel, the P40 rides on fabricated truck frames. The low-weight truck uses horizontal and vertical dampers and shock absorbers for a smooth transfer of tractive force to the frame. We'll be riding Train 14 with Amtrak engineer Bob Roberts, a boomer railroader who worked for Burlington Northern and other western railroads before coming to Amtrak. Bob will share the engineer seat with Tim Clark. We asked him how he feels about operating Amtrak's premier passenger train between Klamath Falls and Seattle, the end of his crew district.
I enjoy it myself. It's beautiful country. It's just something that most people don't get to see because there aren't any roads up here. It's definitely part of Mother Earth, and it's remarkable scenery, and I like it a lot. It's really nice. There's a lot of tunnels. A lot of the block signals are like right around a corner where you have to pretty much know where they're at and stuff. It takes a lot of knowledge to know the mountain, to know it real good. I'm still learning the mountain and where all the block signals are, where all the tunnels are. Like I said earlier, there's 22 tunnels that you go through, and each one of them is a good landmarker for the engineer, so he knows exactly where the next block's coming up, or if there's a speed restriction that you got to slow down to, or whatever. So the tunnels are, they're good markers to know just exactly where they're all at.
Go ahead, Tim.
Several miles west of Crescent Lake, we received some bad news. 14 may have to stop at Crescent Lake for 3 hours or more, while SP struggles to keep the pass open. Finally, the dispatcher tells us we can head down the mountain. What's left unspoken is that we'll be the first train to do so in the hours following the end of the storm. The signal at the west end of Cascade Summit beckons us into the siding, which is almost 8,000 feet long. Standing on the main is the plow train we last saw at Salt Creek Bridge. We leave the east end of the siding and roll up to Tunnel 3. The sight of one of SP's classic cantilever signals at Abernathy sparks a discussion about signal visibility on the mountain.
It's like I was telling you earlier about these tunnels are good markers for us, because then we know right on the other side of that tunnel we got to be down to a crawl if we're working on a yellow block. So they actually help us.
This is Tunnel 4.
544.6. And we got a clear approach to Cruzette.
Here's Tunnel 5, located less than a mile west of Cruzette.
It's right there within 2 cars at each end.
And here's the former rubber switch at the west end of Cruzette siding. SP crews weren't above playing practical jokes in steam days. During the winter, engineers would often blow down their engines as they passed the old Cruzette station. The resulting mist and steam would freeze around the only door to the depot, forcing the operator to crawl out a rear window to get out of the office. We're enjoying the scenery when we plunge into the west end of Tunnel 6. At Tunnel 7, we can't help but think about what SP engineers on the pass went through in steam days. Even with SP's big cab forwards, westbounds seldom exceeded 20 miles per hour. As the train crawled through the longest tunnels, heat and smoke would build up inside the cab.
Clear signal. This is where that 20-mile-an-hour.
Things only got worse when train speed dropped below 20 miles per hour. An SP fireman once measured the temperature inside a helper engine cab at 176 degrees. Hapless crews would pull their jackets or old blankets over their heads and use watches and flashlights to figure out where they were on the mountain. It was common practice for crews to place ice between two wet sponges to cool the air they were breathing inside the tunnels. Conditions were actually worse on passenger engines, which were stuck behind the head-end helpers. Things took a turn for the better when diesels began operating over the pass. All things considered, our guess is that most of SP's old head engineers were more than happy to embrace internal combustion.
Here we are at Fraser.
The snow that frames Tunnel 14 reminds us of one of the worst natural disasters to strike the Cascade Line, the flood of 1964. For 21 days in December, the skies opened up and poured 22 inches of rain on top of 3 feet of wet snow. Water seemed to gush from everywhere as streams overflowed and hurtled everything from fallen trees to bridges down the mountain. For 3 days, 65 men worked around the clock to repair the storm's damage. SP Superintendent W.O. Brown described the Herculean effort as one of the finest examples of teamwork he'd ever seen. When the line finally reopened at 7 p.m. on Sunday, December 27th, SP had lost $5 million in 1964 dollars. We roll out of Tunnel 15 to discover that we have our own weather-related problem, a tree blocking the right-of-way at the west end of Fields. Tim calls the dispatcher on the radio to tell him of our plight. By then, our conductor has bailed off the train to take a closer look for himself. Finally, we start to move backwards. The plan is to take the train down the siding where the tops of the trees are thinner. When the switch opens, we slowly move east into the siding. After we stop, Tim and the conductor check to see if there's a chance that we can simply run over the trees and be on our way. Fat chance. We're stuck in Fields until someone gets here from the Maintenance of Way Department. It seems like a good time to ask Bob what he thinks about his job.
I love being an engineer, and I've tried to leave the railroad before, and it's never worked. You have to use more skill to do this job than other jobs, and the skill level is nothing compared to what it is to be a railroad engineer. More so with Amtrak, because that we are on different host railroads. This is a lot of restricted speed, cautious, very stressful. And you can't allow yourself to get too stressful, because then you're trying to predict something that isn't there, and your reactions are going to react to what isn't there.
We bail off of the 805 to wait for the section person to show up. The thought strikes us that millions of dollars of track, equipment, and personnel are being held hostage by a couple of fallen trees. Nature, we decide, has an ironic sense of humor. Finally, the 7th Cavalry arrives in a high-rail truck, the only way to get to Fields until the access roads are plowed. Our savior is Mr. G.D. Mahon, the Assistant Division Engineer. Wielding a chainsaw, he makes quick work of the tree. It reminds us what Bob said earlier about the trees that grace the pass.
Up here in the mountains, when you're running, and during the winter, when it's this picturesque snowy atmosphere here, during the summer, your trees all the limbs are facing up to the sky, but during the winter, the limbs are all swayed across each other in low, like they're in spiritual prayer, in thanks for what they go through the rest of the year. Some give their all.
When we finally move, it seems like a brass band should be playing. At Fields, we get a chance to see the Y that's used to turn the snow fighting equipment. These section houses remind us that an old passenger coach served as the train order office here between 1941 and 1955. This signal marks the approach to Tunnel 16. We pass an SP Maintenance of Way high rail truck at the slide. We try not to think about how the slide got its name. At milepost 557.1, we enter Tunnel 17. We're on the middle level of the pass headed toward Wikipedia. There are a number of tunnels that are relatively inaccessible except by rail, and Tunnel 19 is one of them. There's a bit of blue sky showing as we amble down the mountain. It's reassuring to see the tops of trees against the sky instead of lying across the right-of-way in front of us. The signal ahead guards the approach to Wikipedia. We knew that Wikipedia used to be a water stop, but we didn't know that a water column survived at the east end of the siding. We passed through Tunnel 20, another short bore. We'll follow the Salt Creek Valley for several miles. This is Heather. The siding on the left breaks the tape measure at 5,582 feet. Near Forest Road 5877, we ponder SP's future. In 1995, Union Pacific announced plans to acquire the SP, thereby creating the railroad that E.H. Harriman had dreamed of when he sparked the construction of the Cascade Line in 1909. It's getting dark as we near the outskirts of Oak Ridge, a quiet time to reflect on what we've witnessed on the pass in the last few years. Nothing endures but change, and SP and the Cascades are fated to change. But until then, we'll treasure our memories of Southern Pacific's Cascade Crossing.
Thank you for watching this Publisher's Choice edition of the Ultimate Railroading DVD series. We hope you look forward to future Publisher's Choice DVDs as together we rediscover the past, enjoy the present, and look to the future of the world of trains around us.